So you're notoriously very quiet about your clients, but I'm just going to name.
I am.
I'm going to name a few so we get a little context. Your clients have included Monica Lewinsky, Kaiser, Sony Pictures, among many other Fortune 500 companies, and most recently, a little divorce that you guys may or may not heard of, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt.
I can't confirm or deny any of
that. But I want to get into this because this is a really important conversation for anyone at a big company in the internet world right now. Things can spiral out of control in a crisis on social media like Facebook, Twitter. Mm-hmm. What are the tips and insights for this audience that they can learn from what you've done with crisis management?
Yeah, let me just say a few things. I think number one, this is, I'm sure that most of you know this, that bad news travels fast, right? Faster than good news for sure. So that's one. That's one. The other thing that I would say in terms of news when you think about it, that the negative news travels, there can be a bad story and it will be out in less than 15 seconds. Now, what's interesting about the crisis world is that you could have a crisis, and I would say about a quarter of the crises that happen travel internationally around the world in less than 10 hours. Now, compare that to some of the research that we've done where corporations take at least 10 to 15 hours to put out a meaningful statement, right? So by the time that you are organized internally and you are figuring out what to say, you will already have lost the game because you're about 10 or 15 hours behind the curve. That's just really critical.
Why do you think that companies wait so long, and what's like the ideal time frame to respond?
It's too much deliberating, in the sense that ultimately somebody has to make a decision about what to say, and so oftentimes particularly when legal issues are involved, sometimes companies don't want to say anything because they want to say no comment. I can think of 1,000 ways to say no comment without saying no comment. But you need to be very deliberate in your word choice. You need to already have a communication system plan in place in your company so that when something happens like this, you are ready to go, that it should not take that kind of time. You lose so much ground because within that 10 or 15 hour lead time that you're behind in, the narrative is already set in. And so you are behind the curve, which is not good. Another insight I would say is that oftentimes people get overwhelmed. You get these social media reports and it says, spike up in Twitter and Facebook, and it's the level of conversation that frightens people. But oftentimes I think what you want to focus on are the key influences. Like all conversation is not equal. And so you want to focus on what and who is driving the conversation so you can get at the root of it, basically. That makes sense.
Makes sense to me. I'm curious. So let's actually I want to take some questions from the audience, but before that, let's take an example of a non-client that you can talk about, and I want to hear like what you would have done differently there. Okay. So let's start with Wells Fargo.
Well, let me just see here. Let me think of the top few things that do. Well, first of all, it took a very long time to say something. That would be number one. I think number two, there was a lack of transparency. Did you like the way I said it? Yeah, a lack of transparency in dealing with the issue. And I also think one of the key things that was clearly a problem there was a lack of responsibility and ownership, right? I can't tell you how much that goes a long way. a good contrast to that, I think, is the CEO of General Motors, who has done a very good job at owning up. We made a mistake. This is horrible. This is what we're going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again. But it wasn't that kind of ownership there. And also, too, I think there was a huge delay and also not understanding the magnitude of the level of outrage of customers and employees. And it was just a huge disconnect there, huge disconnect, yeah. And here's the other thing, too, that's important in crisis that relates to this, is that there's a lack of understanding of the landscape. And by that, I mean you've got to understand when a crisis occurs, what's the backdrop of the environment in which your company is operating in. So it was no surprise that there were going to be hearings on the Hill about that, given the landscape and the environment, you know, with
Since
the
financial services.
Exactly right, exactly right. That was no surprise. And that was a very bad situation.
How could they have gotten ahead of something like that, you know, with the hearings and the political, or the, you know, the government involvement?
Well, I tell you really how they could get ahead of it. It goes to a point that I want to raise, is that research tells us that a lot of the crises arise from culture, right? And so if you think about the kind of culture that you work in, if it's a culture of fear, people don't feel like they can speak out, or people are not encouraged to make decisions, you're not addressing the root of the problem. Because when you think about this situation in Wells Fargo, I think it was reported that in, 2012 or 2013, all of this started to bubble up, right? And so nobody was paying attention to it. But it's clearly was part of the culture. So I think that you want to examine that. The other way that I think that folks can generally get ahead of things is, we did just recently, it was interesting, a half-a-day session with a Fortune 500 company. And it was all the management team in there. And I said, so tell me what keeps you up at night, right? What's your worst fear of what could happen? And it was about 10 division heads in there. I went around the room, and each one of them told me their worst fear. And then the second question I asked, I said, so do you have a plan in place to deal with that? Not one person had a plan. And so another little tip is that even if you don't know the exact crisis that's going to occur, there's basic planning that you can do. And studies show that you have a 75% chance of recovering from a crisis or a company, issue or problem if you have a plan in place already, which makes sense.
That's great,
Yeah.
Great advice. I want to open it up to any questions that you all may have for Judy. Anyone? Oh, here, there's one right here.
Hi. I put my glasses on.
Hi, Judy. It's Nancy. What happens when an employee has a different need for an outcome than the corporation, than the populace at large, and there are too many competing voices?
Well, look, first and foremost, I think oftentimes we don't take care of ourselves in the ways that we should. And I think that if you are in that situation, you need to have your own advice and counsel. Because at some point, yes, your interests are going to be different than the company. Another good example as well is that sometimes we get calls from members who sit on boards, right? And are not pleased with how the company is handling a crisis because their individual brand and reputation is at stake as a board member. So I think that when you feel as if you are in conflict, you most certainly should have your own advice and counsel on that. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I would say that I want to speak about, I'm looking at the time, is that, oftentimes people call people that do what I do when there is a crisis. There's a lot that you can do before a crisis occurs. And one of the things that I would encourage you to do is some sort of assessment in your company about where the risk, where are the weak points, because you know them, and really make a plan to be prepared for that. That to me is critical. Yeah.
Looks like there's a question over here.
Get somebody in the back.
Lots of questions. Oh, yes, of course.
Hi, Heidi Anderson from Time Inc. I was just curious if, you maybe can't comment, but if Billy Bush has enlisted your help and what you would advise him to do at this juncture if he did.
I'll interject and I say that I asked her this question too.
And I'll tell you exactly what I said in the green room. Yeah, I can't comment on that.
A question in the back, over here.
Hi, Judy. It's Melody.
Hi, Melody.
Hillary has 3 weeks left. It feels like there's a crisis every day. WikiLeaks. What would you tell her to do for the next 3 weeks?
Oh, that's a good question. Look, I think generally speaking, people want to hear about what candidates can do for them, right? And so if I am running, no matter who is campaigning, people need to focus on what that person is going to do. That's what I'm going to vote on, the issues that I care about. And so to me, the more I hear about that and how it affects my daily life, that's what I would like to hear about.
I want to ask a question here because Melody brings up a good point with cyber attacks.
Oh, God, yes. Yep.
Everyone is susceptible. It's the sort of next big frontier for warfare. You've been through it, of course, within your work. Like, where should we even start? Where should some of these companies even start when it comes to crisis management and cyber attacks?
Well, I think, first of all, we work with a lot of companies on that. I think you have to realize that it's going to happen. You just should just understand that. The question is when. So you need to do all you possibly can to get prepared for it. A lot of companies do simulations, but to me they are not as real as they can be. They really aren't. So it should not be sort of that planned simulation. It should be, it happens this day. Nobody knows that you're coming. This is the way we do it for our team, and this is what happens, so that you are prepared for it as much as you can be. The other thing that I would say as well is that more and more, I think consumers are feeling, particularly when consumers are affected, that companies are not doing all that they can do. So, you know, for example, when personal information gets hacked or credit card information, you know, the first thing a company says they're going to do is, oh, we're going to talk about, we'll give free credit counseling. Really? That is just not enough. That is just really, for starters, people now expect that. So the expectations are different because as a nation, we've been through so many of these. And those are the kinds of things that you can have in place now.
Well, you know, we're out of time. And Judy, I really appreciate your time this
Thank
morning.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.